This next panel of speakers is Denis, who's on his way. We have Jason Hark and then Jonathan Powers. This will run till about 3:05, 3:10, so they will give their spiel as the last one, and then hopefully about 5-10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. I do want to start officially by introducing Mr. Powers. On April 9, 2012, Mr. Powers was appointed by President Obama to serve as the administration's Federal Environmental Executive. The Office of the Federal Environmental Executive, housed within the White House Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, is responsible for the promotion of environmental and energy sustainability in federal agencies and the implementation of President Obama's executive order on federal sustainability, including the Green Gov initiative. Prior to joining CEQ, Mr. Powers served as the Special Advisor on Energy in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army, Installations and Energy and Environment. He also served as the Chief Operating Officer at the Truman National Security Project, where he focused on energy security issues. And during this time, Mr. Powers founded an Operation Free, which is a campaign for veterans to advocate for national energy and climate security policies. And prior to the Truman Project, John served for 4 years as an officer in the U.S. Army, including a 15-month tour in Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So, John, it's all yours.
Thanks so much. So before I sort of introduce the panel, and while we're sort of waiting for Denis, I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the federal government in terms of energy and sustainability. And I'm going to start with a story, and it sort of falls back on my time in the military. When I was a young officer, I showed up to my Army unit, and it was my first day on the job. I was supposed to be in charge of a group of 40 men. This is a combat unit at the time. It was all men. And I was a fresh elementary education major showing up to take over an artillery unit. So had very little experience in terms of this space. But luckily I had a fantastic platoon sergeant who had 17 years of experience and had seen plenty of fresh lieutenants come through. And he grabbed my lapels and he dragged me around to the side of the motor pool. And he said, "Sir, there's two types of leaders in the military. There's those that lead by rank, and there's those that lead by example. The soldiers are going to follow those that outrank them. It's the way the military works. But they want to follow someone that sets an example." And so that's a mantra I try to carry with me through life, but I'm also lucky to work for a president that understands that and has called on the federal government to lead by example in the areas of energy and sustainability. He reiterated this, as Jonathan Pershing mentioned, last June in the climate action speech he gave here in Georgetown. But he's given us some really substantial goals: reduction of greenhouse gases, increased renewable energy, better water and waste management, petroleum reduction. And what we've done through an executive order that I oversee, which sort of calls on us officially to lead by example, it's helped put in an infrastructure to manage to this. So now we have senior sustainability officers at each of the agencies. For instance, Undersecretary Kennedy, who's speaking here shortly, is the Senior Sustainability Officer here at the State Department. And he's put in place a structure working with his team, Landon and others, to find ways to better manage the work that they're doing in a sustainable fashion. And the savings should not be overlooked. We have over 500,000 buildings, 600,000 vehicles, 1.8 million civilian employees that come back and forth to work every day. So the work we're doing to just drive greenhouse gas down alone, and we've reduced greenhouse gases by 15% since 2008. Just driving greenhouse gases alone and meeting our goals will have saved $11 billion in energy costs. So it's very substantial efforts. And we're working closely with the folks here at State who are doing incredible work, both here at home and their domestic installations, but also overseas. Ambassadors like Ambassador Thorne in Italy is finding ways to use historic buildings and finding ways to not only bring energy efficiency, but to bring energy efficiency appliances and lights, and implementing recycling programs and working with the local community to find ways to educate others or to learn from others. For us, collaboration is key to this. So what we can learn from our folks in the international front, work we can learn from the folks that the private sector are doing. We're trying to have constant dialogue such as this to learn from each other. So with that, I want to sort of open up and have a conversation with, I think, an incredibly distinguished panel and two leaders who understand what it means to lead by example. And two leaders who I think have been pretty transformational in the work that they've done for the organizations that they represent. But obviously, Denis had a brief introduction earlier, and I think the best way to introduce him is to basically point to what Time Magazine said about him as one of the heroes of the planet. And I think the work that he's doing in Seattle, with the healthy building that they put up in Seattle, is taking the challenge of leading by example to the furthest degree possible. And the stuff that we can learn, for instance, just the chemicals alone, that we can find ways to implement into our federal buildings is incredibly important. And then Jason Hartkey from U.S. Green Building Council. Jason's the vice president at U.S. Green Building Council and is really driving policy both at the federal level, the state level, and also on international dialogues. And for those that aren't familiar with WGBC, probably when you walked in the State Department, you saw a plaque for the work that they've done on the LEED front. They have helped establish a culture here in the United States where tenants are demanding that their buildings are healthier. And leading by example in this space is critical to that. So I'm looking forward to sort of our conversation. And I wanted to open up first with a question to Denis, and you hit on this slightly before, but what role do our government buildings, both on the international front, embassies that are in cities around the world, and here at home where we have folks representing other countries whose embassies are here in Washington, what role do they play in helping educate others in terms of healthy buildings?
Embassies and consulates are obviously the way that governments project themselves into other countries and other cultures. And what you do in that building says something that's important about your country. So I'm just delighted that we are moving increasingly to incorporating these environmental and health attributes in governmental buildings, because it says this is an important part of the kind of world that we are trying to build. It gives an opportunity for people who are coming in and sometimes waiting very long periods of time to get their visas, to get a bit of an educational exposure to the things that are on display there and that tell you about what the consulate has done and is doing. It gives American industry an opportunity to showcase their technologies, for designers to show what you can do that is valuable for those buildings. And the obverse side of that, when you were talking about Italy, there are a number of parts of the world that have buildings that are old by their standards and that are sort of beyond belief by American standards, that were built centuries before America was founded. We're trying to learn now what we can do with our buildings. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has set up a Preservation Green Lab to figure out how can you, without defiling the character of a building, reduce its energy use by maybe 75 or 80%. And I'm sure there's just much that we can be learning from the efforts that our people are making in their buildings in other countries that have been doing this for a very long time. Finally, in terms of economics, I just was learning from Landon of an example. In one of the State Department's buildings, they had a broken thermostat that cost $8 up on the roof. And nobody could figure out why this building's energy bills were high until they actually got the building metered. They were able to follow the performance. An engineer who understood what these particular lines meant on the chart found that it was that thermostat. They replaced it. It was $8 plus labor, and it saved them, I think it was $375,000 a year. The opportunities occasionally are kind of spectacular.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny, if you actually look back just 4 years ago, a lot of our buildings didn't have meters on them. And I think we're getting to the point now where we're beginning to get some more of that information. And so Jason, what are some of the current trends you're seeing, both at USGBC domestically, but also internationally, that we can sort of learn from in terms of best practices and try to find ways to implement?
Sure. I just want to back up and say that for folks who were here earlier and noticed that this seat was empty, it's because both John and I wanted to make sure that we were sitting in between, that we had Denis sitting in between. We could both be right next to him. Hero of the planet is an understatement. The guy is a student. He walks in. He says, I'm going to organize an event, small little event, just so happens to spark a global movement. He gets into green building for the first time, and just so happens, you saw the list of firsts that he had. He just so happens to arguably create the greenest building on earth. So it's so fantastic to be with you here, Denis, and to see you again.
Those of you who don't know should know that Jason's grandfather was U.S. Senator Hartkey, and obviously his gift of gab passed through the generations.
Well, thank you. Anyway, it's fantastic to be here with two great friends, John and Denis. I represent the U.S. Green Building Council, and we just so happen to know a little bit about leadership. We are probably best known for our LEED green building rating system. We captured lightning in a bottle in many respects, and it was a simple formula. We wanted to define with the community, with all the stakeholders coming together, what leadership meant as it relates to buildings, in energy efficiency, renewables, building materials, innovation, all those aspects that are the ingredients of green building, and then challenge the market and take that system out to the market and let them see what they could do. And boy, oh boy, have they responded. We've got 20,000 certified projects around the world. We've got another 35,000 in the pipeline. And of course, you know, there were early adopters. There were early actors that made a huge difference in green building and the green building movement today. And of course, the federal government was one of them. Today, 1,300 projects, the federal government has LEED certified projects representing about 2 million square feet of real estate. They've got another 4,000 projects in the pipeline representing about 500 million square feet of real estate. So, of course, these buildings are and do become iconic. They become catalysts in their own right as, you know, I don't know how many of you, or you could raise your hands for me, how many of you know Ambassador Bruce Orrick? But boy, oh boy, has he been an ambassador for green building all around the country, all around the world. And, you know, I think that these buildings, as Denis was saying, they are like ambassadors. They're doing their own diplomacy. Every time we have a building like the LEED Gold building in Burundi, it's the first LEED building in the whole country, and it's an embassy, that building serves a diplomatic purpose. It says, hey, these are the types of technologies, these are types of aspirational goals that you can hit if you do this right. So get back to your question, John, on the trends. You know, I like to say that green building has a little bit of its own Moore's law. Every 3 years, the uptake of green building is doubling. So we're seeing this exponential growth in green building, and you know, the primary driver for that, I think there's a lot of conversation that we can have about the policy, and policy certainly is a factor. Leadership by example policy in particular, like what governments are doing around the world. But the financial driver, as many of the businesses that are here today, Phillips and Johnson Controls can attest, you know, making the business case for green building, that this saves you money, $11 billion in savings, as John just said. That's spectacular. Boy, oh boy, is that a motivation. So we're seeing that take off everywhere. You know, the trends that we have to fight against are the myths related to green building. So these barriers, as it relates to awareness, we found that many executives found, you know, in terms of what their perception was, they thought that green building cost 17% more, when in reality, projects around the world are building green for not a penny more. So we've got a lot of work to do, but we are seeing, you know, great growth, and it continues to be a great opportunity.
Well, to sort of build off that last comment, Jason, I think, you know, now that the two softballs have been thrown, let's get into the sort of the dialogue. You know, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges, but a very specific challenge that many folks on the government side, both here in the United States, but also internationally, is they're having conversations with their leadership about, you know, why we should be investing in this, why we should be building or retrofitting in this space. We're also we're living in a time where, as if you read the Washington Post, you know that our budgets aren't growing for the federal government, and so every dollar we're spending is fought against another dollar when we're even open. So we are trying to make a pitch to our leadership in many of the agencies, or even I think our folks who are running embassies from other countries here, to help them invest in what really presents our long-term savings. But what advice do you have for them to drive that dialogue so that they're able to go back and make that pitch to folks, that they can get the investments they need to do the healthy buildings, the green buildings, the retrofitting that needs to be done?
The question for me?
Both of you.
Okay. You want to start off?
Go ahead. I will begin by saying that I had not previously heard that the number of LEED certified buildings was doubling every 3 years. And I'm guessing that's something that we ought to start thinking of not as Moore's law, but as Hartkey's law.
And it's not LEED specifically. There's other great green building rating systems around the world, but the green building uptake, the entire market is doubling. Yes, thanks for letting me coin I think McGraw Hill will may have some problems with that. Well, you know, the opportunity to push harder, to scale up is a big one. I think one of the things that we've seen with green building is what is the scale? And Dennis got to this a bit and talked about how he had to think about his building in terms of almost an urban ecosystem. And when, you know, we've got this really interesting product in LEED that has gone through 4 iterations since 2000. So every 3 years, we do something a little bit wacky that almost no other institution would even think about doing. We have a product out there, and about every 3 years, we make it more difficult to use. We make everything harder, and hopefully getting up to where the living building challenge is, where you actually have a truly sustainable building. So it's very difficult to have that market conversation, and then they start to get used to LEED, they start to get used to green building, they start to get used to the type of innovative practices that can be used across the board to get you where you want to go, and then all of a sudden you say, no, we're twisting it up on you, and now you have to jump higher and go further. So I think the idea there is we have to continue to make sure that we're teaching folks that sustainability isn't you know, a destination, it's a journey. And in that regard, I think we are doing some great things. Whether you're doing LEED or you're doing living buildings or anything else in between, there's an opportunity to get on this escalator of leadership. Energy efficiency retrofitting is absolutely key. We got to look at our existing building stock. The existing building stock is going to have a very tough time of being able to get into maybe even a LEED building and certainly a living building. So how do we get to that existing building stock that does represent, at least in the United States, represents 40% of our energy use and 35% of our carbon emissions? And I'm proud to say that LEED is certifying 2 million square feet a day, and of that 2 million square feet, half of it is in existing buildings. So the existing building challenge, I think, is a big one, John.
The arguments that you would make if you're trying to get your budgets increased, I suspect everybody in Washington has a better sense of the answer than I do. But it would seem to me that there's a scale, and at one end is you invest $8 in a new thermostat and you save $375,000 a year. That's probably a pretty easy sell. And at the other end, there's something that may be a credible thing to do, but it's getting you 8% a year. For most of America, 8% guaranteed income per year is a pretty good thing, but if you're doing a capital budgeting thing inside the federal government and the money from one comes out of one pocket and it gets no credit for the savings on the other pocket, you have an administrative, bureaucratic, organizational thing that has to be overcome, and in a rational government, which once again, someday I hope we will have, we will get those changes made so that you can make those kinds of sensible investments. Let me say one thing about sort of the elephant in the room with regard to LEED, because there have been a fair number of articles recently about LEED that have been critical of it in a way that I think is completely unfair, and it's better for me to talk about it perhaps than Jason, because he will sound defensive, whereas I don't have a particular stake in it. We went on a different course. There has been nothing that has had as much impact on the American green building environment as the U.S. Green Building Council. It's just been extraordinary. And across the board, we've had a huge, thousands and thousands of buildings that are vastly better as a consequence. There's an assault going on right now by the American Chemical Council and by the forest products industries that some of their products can't go into a LEED building, and so they are running a campaign to try to make sure that government agencies and that state governments don't buy LEED. It is one of the unfortunate aspects of the economic system that we have, that corporate self-interest causes people sometimes to run campaigns that are duplicitous and adverse to the best interests of the society. And I guess I just urge you not to pay any attention to that to the extent that any of you are in the crosshairs of these groups, because it really has been an unfair campaign. The news articles that you've occasionally seen are similarly unfair, the critical ones, which have to do with very, very green buildings that have very high energy budgets. What you've got is a green building that, if operated well and you've got relatively low energy activities taking place inside it, would have wonderful energy budgets. But once you've got the building constructed, then at the moment, LEED is kind of finished. It has done its job. If you fill up a building with stockbrokers, each of them has 7 screens in front of himself or herself, and they leave them on all night long as well as all day long, you're going to have a gigantic energy bill regardless of how well the building was built. The things that determine the energy use are, 1, what's the climate like outside? 2, how many people are in the building? And 3, what do those people do? And then 4, of course, how is the building constructed? LEED has been about how the building is constructed, and it's done a fabulous job, but you can't criticize it on the basis of those other factors that it has no control over. It is moving now increasingly into an assessment of performance of the building, and as it's twisting the shorts of people in the development community by making things tougher and tougher, the performance aspects will be part of that moving into the future. But there will be relatively few of you willing to accept the living building challenge right now. We paid 23% more for our building than for a standard Class A office building in Seattle. That's something that most developers won't do. I'm hopeful that some institutions will, because it's going to be around for 250 years, and it's going to be a fabulous investment 10 years from now. But that's not what you do if you're going to build a building and flip it to a REIT or an insurance company as soon as you get it fully leased. Since you are probably not going to go living building immediately, I would hope you will go all the way with LEED. It is almost irresponsible today to build a building that isn't at least LEED Platinum. And I think anyone that does is going to regret it within the next 10 years.
So Dennis, you talked about 2020 being the 50th anniversary birthday. And if we were sitting on a panel now in 2020, looking back at the conversation that we had today, what are the things that you hope will be accomplished between now and then in this space, in the living building, sort of green building space?
I remember George Burns used to say, when they asked, he'd begin his presentations in his latter years, he'd show up and say, "It's a real pleasure to be here tonight." Of course, at 93, it's a real pleasure to be anywhere. So talking about us on a panel in 2020, whatever we're talking about, I'm probably going to be happy. The kinds of things that are now beginning to happen, I think, are potentially transformational. We're seeing new technologies evolving at a rapid rate. The Moore's Law, which really deals with compound semiconductors, has been in its own derivative way affecting the compound semiconductors in photovoltaic arrays as well. And the costs have been coming down, the efficiencies have been going up, and we've got, I believe, a leapfrog ahead of us as we move into nanotechnologies with the potential to double efficiencies and drive the current already low prices down, I think, spectacularly further, as well as to be doing similar sorts of things with supercapacitors and batteries and what have you. So I think in 2020, you'll have the opportunity in much of the world, probably 3/4 of the world, to have energy self-sufficient buildings. In ours, we pump our surplus electricity in the summer out to a utility, which stores water behind a dam, and it's a battery that's part of the utility grid. I think by 2020, it's going to be affordable to do that inside buildings. You know, we replace 2 to 3% of the building stock per year. And so to make a transformational thing, you have to get started replacing all of that stock every year, and you'd have the transition completed in 50 years. So, and if you're only replacing, as at the moment, what, 10% with pretty green buildings, it's going to, you don't ever get there. So what I'm hoping is that we'll get in place a bunch of financial drivers, economic incentives, and frankly, regulations that will move us aggressively around the world to be making the progress that's needed. Final thing, this is way too wonky to go into here, but it will be written up. It has been written up in the New York Times already if you want to search it out. We're doing a thing for retrofits in buildings, this challenge that Jason brought up a moment ago, where the tenants in our building will be paying the bills that they would pay in an ordinary building that doesn't have all the bells and whistles that we have. They're paying for the energy services, not the kilowatt hours that they receive. We will measure the difference between what that regular building built to code would use and what we actually use, and sell the power that is saved, that metered saved electricity, back to the utility, just as though regular electricity from a wind farm. The utility has an absolute obligation to meet all of our needs if we build the building to code. If we don't need that much electricity, we can sell back to the utility what we're not using. And our usage patterns are exactly the same as everyone else's usage patterns in the grid, so we're absolutely following the power demand curve. It is the most useful energy that they can conceivably buy. So they will pay us retail plus 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. On balance, we will be getting back more energy from the utility than we are paying, more money from the utility than we're paying to the utility. So as long as all of our tenants behave correctly and meet their energy goals, they will be, although they're paying their bills as we're going through, and they're relatively high, at the end of the year, they get all of that money back because of the investments we made in the building. To the extent that you start spreading that, and I should say there's one building and one utility in the world that is doing this right now, but assuming that the pilot program works out and the utility likes it and we spread this across the nation and hopefully elsewhere, I think it could be an absolutely profound redirection of resources. Final cap. The utility came into us while we were constructing the building, took a look at what we were going to do, have their conservation incentives programs, and offered to simply give us a cash grant of $70,000 to do what we were going to do, because most people wouldn't do what we were going to do, and that was their incentive to us to do it. We said, no, let us instead sell you our saved energy. They spent more than a year analyzing this and found out that it was more to their advantage because if we didn't save it, they didn't pay it on this other one. And so they signed off on a 20-year contract. Now, instead of getting $70,000 up front, if we operate the way that we should, we'll get $40,000 a year for the next 20 years. The difference of what you can invest if you're going to be getting $40,000 a year for 20 years and what you get for $70,000 up front is night and day. One of it gets you to a pretty pale green, you change some light bulbs and things. The other gets you a deep green building.
So on the flip side, the federal government is taking a little bit of a different approach to that same model. We're doing $2 billion worth of energy savings performance contracts right now, which is a way for us, in the lack of capital, to be doing these deep retrofits. And we're now partnering with sort of the mush market to try to educate them on some of the tools we're using, the contracting mechanisms we're using. A little bit of different model.
President Obama made a $4 billion.
$2 billion. Okay. Oh, no, there's $2 billion in the private sector too.
Okay,
So the
right.
federal commitment is $2 billion.
$4 billion total.
So
Does everybody know what the mush market is?
municipals, universities, states, and hospitals. Schools and hospitals, sorry. So with that, I wanted to take a second and open it up to the floor. I know we're sort of time constrained, so I want to make sure we get some questions from the floor. And if not, I can continue to ask questions. So if you got a question, please go to the mic or stand up and ask it.
I'll stand up. Bronco Jersey with Deloitte. Dennis, the most obvious solution seems to be just have codes that require you to build a very efficient building. Where's the pushback on that?
Did everyone hear that? One elegant and simple solution is to merely have codes that require all buildings to be super efficient. What's the pushback? The first pushback, as I suspect you would know from Deloitte, is from the realtors who view this as boosting the costs and hence lowering the number of sales. Second pushback has been from the developers who say, don't boss me around any more than you already have, and much less with a code that is really tough and sophisticated. It's not an easy thing anywhere to pass. What we've done in Seattle, and that I think makes a good deal of sense, and is being done elsewhere as well, is have your standard codes, and we've got a pretty tough energy code. Our new energy code would require you to use about half of what the average commercial building in Seattle now uses. So it's an advance, though it's still 3 times as much per square foot as our building will be using. Is that instead of having the standard code, another approach is to say you can have a performance code. And if you do that, you still have to meet the fire standards, the safety standards, the health standards, but everything else you can kind of ignore other than getting the neighborhood to approve the design. So that's to say our building has far more windows than you could have in a building in Seattle. But because of the way that we constructed them and the daylighting advantages that we get out of it and so forth, we save a fair amount of energy. It's a very moderate climate, but a kind of a dark climate, so we want more daylight to come in. And on and on. We can do things that are banned by code as long as we meet the performance standards, which means we have to be significantly better than a code building would be. I think that gives you the kind of creativity that's needed on the part of architects and engineers and, frankly, contractors. We had what's called an integrated design process where the architects, the engineers, the general contractor, the solar engineers, the developers, and a professor from the University of Washington who was doing a study of us met every week for 3 years, putting this thing together with everybody being involved in it. So there were no surprises like you typically have when the architect hands it off to the engineer and the engineer hands it off to the contractor. Everybody brought their expertise in from the beginning because it was a tough challenge. But I think that is a way to approach it in a code sense that says, and you know, we tried this in the Carter administration. We had building energy performance standards and the pushback was heroic. And so now we're trying to do it city by city, state by state, and are more likely to be successful there.
In the back?
You talked about performance contracting in federal space, making a lot of progress there on the own space. What are the plans on the lease space? How are you going to deal with that?
How are we going from the federal sector?
Federal sector, but it's a problem pervasive in any public sector. That's how we lead the way on that.
That's a good question. And I'd point to my partners at GSA, the General Services Administration. They've got a new commissioner of public buildings, one by the name of Dorothy Robine, who has really taken this head on. And one of the things that GSA is moving aggressively on is putting into their contracts a green lease and making that sort of standard across the work they're doing. And I believe, and I'll have to double check this, but I believe it's public, so other folks can access what they're asking for sort of in that green lease. And part of it is going to be the delay in turnover. So as we start to move forward with this, and a lot of it has to do with the folks that are in that space. So I think the chairman of FERC, who is right over by Union Station, and he looked at his building and he said, you know, I really want to push the envelope for what I'm trying to get done here. So as they were looking for space, the folks that facilitated that contract at GSA were pushing the contracting mechanism as far as they could in that conversation. But the reality is that's going to take time for us to get there. But also, we are making a significant effort to reduce our footprint in a lot of spaces. So hopefully we'll be moving out of some of that lease space and into, I think about the folks here at GSA headquarters, and we talked about a retrofitted building. They took maybe not the prettiest building in the world, and they've implemented a hoteling system now for their operators. So you have, in many cases, some career bureaucrats who've been around for 35 years and have been working to get that corner office with the windows so they can close the door and be on the phone. And now they have to find a way to sort of access this new system to find a desk every day when they go to work. But the initial response so far has been fantastic. People have loved it. It's changing the way GSA is operating. So we're beginning to test and pilot some of these more progressive initiatives. And I think Dorothy is going to help that in the GSA piece. But it is no doubt about it a challenge.
Has been like music to my ears, hearing the great work that you're doing in improving infrastructure here. I was also delighted to hear that you're involved globally. I'd like to know how much you're involved in Africa specifically. Africa is ready for business. Africa needs infrastructure. One of our main impediments is lack of infrastructure. And if we can lay the foundation of our economic development with the kind of infrastructure that you are providing, buildings with energy efficiency, I think Africa will really develop very fast. How can we work with you? What can we do to have you in Africa? And more specifically, let me say in Uganda, we're ready.
Can I point this one at Jason to start out with? Yeah.
Sure. Well, like I said earlier, the movement that Denis helped spark is global. WGBC is a Green Building Council of the United States. A lot of our work is fortunate to be international, but we have an umbrella group called the World Green Building Council, and that World Green Building Council represents green building councils in over 100 countries. One of probably the best and most mature green building council in Africa is probably South Africa's Green Building Council. And in fact, the way that the WGBC kind of operates, it's all about building capacity and bringing these green building opportunities into these countries as fast as possible. And the South Africa GBC is kind of the hub for trying to get green building to spread throughout Africa. There are a lot of good opportunities there. I'd say that the U.S. government is actually doing quite a bit through, and you're at the right place, State Department, USAID, the Jeff, others are doing quite a bit more with green building. In fact, we're getting pulled in more kind of in a consultative role to advise on how they can seed some of these opportunities, and organizations just like ours that provide the resources and the tools for the market to scale up green building. But I would put you in touch with probably some of our sister green building councils that are based in Africa. Can I go back to just a couple other points? The idea of what's next, we talk a lot about that, and you talked about code. I think there's certainly an opportunity to push the ceiling, and Denis and I can talk about that until the cows come home. But we have to tie what we're doing to raise the floor, and I think that there's a huge opportunity to continue to raise the bar for building codes. There's a lot of work to be done there. There's a lot of pushback among a variety of stakeholders. So I just wanted there's a couple other things that have popped up and that I think are very important, one of which is more transparency in our energy use. And now you've got this league of green embassies. We've got this league of benchmarking cities, if you will, around the country that are sprouted up: Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco. I believe Seattle's on that list, but it's about just less than 10, I think, cities that are requiring benchmarking and disclosure of their buildings, usually of a certain size, over 25,000 square feet or 50,000 square feet. And that's making a huge difference. I mean, imagine if you're in this space and you actually have a financial model like these energy service companies do that helps these building owners save money without having to put a dime up in first costs. If they have an understanding of where you are in terms of that energy use, they can come in and start making a case. So that transparency is, I think, a big deal. Disclosure and benchmarking is starting to spread in cities around the country, and I'm really glad to see that that's going to be a focus of Earth Day in the next couple of years. And the only other thing I wanted to mention, and I'll be very brief, the amount of buildings are enormously complex, and the amount of measurement that we used to do just 40, 50 years ago it doesn't even compare. I mean, I love the statistics that Denis was saying. He goes, the building is now measuring the wind direction and the speed and the rain and all these other things. Big data, IT is merging with green building as we speak, and John has a lot to say about this subject. But that is going to open up the doors for so much innovation in terms of building science and green building, smarter buildings. I mean, not only is Denis's building a living building, it's probably one of the smartest, most intelligent buildings on the planet. So all these things merged together, the amount of measurement and data that we're now trying to grapple with in green building is really revolutionary.
And I'd say one of the best things you can do is not reinvent the wheel. So take a look at what's here in the U.S. For instance, EPA has a wonderful program called Portfolio Manager, which has become sort of an industry standard for data. And now they're working with the Canadians, for instance, to implement a similar model, and probably would be willing to look at other countries to help, or at least provide the framework so that you're not having to do the investment in the research that they've already done for what is now sort of a proven, at least baseline in benchmarking that Jason hit on. So time for one more question. Michael?
Denis, the sellback of your electricity to the utility, is it sold back as produced solar power or as an efficiency? And if an efficiency, then John, why don't we have a way to recognize efficiencies under the tax code? Because it affects all the green buildings as renewable energy.
So the question is whether the power that we are selling back, the metered savings that we're selling back to the utility, is being sold as savings or whether it's being sold effectively as power. And if it's being sold as power, why doesn't the technology that makes that possible receive the same treatment under the tax code as green energy does? Incredibly good, albeit complicated question that I will try not to get bogged down on. We have a solar system that's on the roof of the building, and that complicates all of this stuff about efficiency. But you should think of the solar system as being just purely net metered. When we're producing more than we use, then the utility will buy it from us at its retail price. When we are, it will buy it from us at its wholesale price, and then when we are consuming more than we're producing, we buy from the utility at retail price. It's a standard that is common across the United States. We didn't, because we were pushing something that was a very hard sell and pretty innovative and incredibly complicated on the efficiency side, we decided to place all of our bets on that. The stuff on the efficiency side is being sold effectively as power. What we're entering into is modeled very, very, very closely on a power purchase agreement like the utility would have with a wind farm or a solar array, except that it doesn't produce energy when the wind blows. It produces energy when we're saving it, which is when the utility needs it. And there we get a much richer compensation from the utility than we do for the solar energy. And with regard to why it doesn't qualify for incentives and subsidies, it's, the political system is imperfect. I will say, the understatement of the day. But the presumption under it is that there is a huge amount of efficiency that is very cost effective. And that if you can bundle the very cost effective with the somewhat less cost effective with the not so cost effective, you can get spectacular savings as a bundle without the requirement of something that will push the technology. The reason that the incentives are out there for solar and for wind and for geothermal is the belief that there's heroic technological development that can happen, these leapfrog technologies that I mentioned earlier, as well as a simple learning curve, that as you produce more and more, it gets cheaper and cheaper. And that has certainly turned out to be true. Every time we have doubled solar production, on average, the cost of solar has gone down about 18%. So you're trying to do that. You don't do that on the efficiency side as it has been viewed by our legislators. So they've singled it out. It's not wildly irrational. And in the current environment, I'm just happy to get it for whatever I can get it for. If I could, since that was the last question, though, if I can abuse it since I've got the microphone in front of me, and since the CEO of the Earth Day Network is over on the side of the room wearing her usual hard-toed shoes and will kick me if we don't say this, I want to just reiterate that the next 2 years, internationally, the theme for Earth Day is going to be green cities and greening the built environment. We would love to have all of you, all of your countries, all of your facilities taking part in this, to the extent that you're doing something extraordinary by, say, 2015. Hopefully you can have tours. You can do things that will call everyone's attention to what these opportunities are. These foreign embassies and consulates around the world are just the most extraordinary educational vehicles. And finally, we'd love to have you have these kinds of forums hosted in all of the other countries of the world for all of the embassies that are in that country as well. You can become sort of the cutting edge of this greening the built environment movement globally, and I strongly encourage you to do that. Thank you.
Jason?
To that question, or just
closing
remarks? Well, the one thing that the U.S. Green Building Council and other green building councils are working on around the world that I think is of particular note is not just greener and more sustainable buildings, but more resilient buildings. And I just want to put that on the marker. Everything that we do when we design a building, when we look at the factors that go into designing our heat and air conditioning, we look at past temperature data in previous years. We don't look forward, and in a changing climate where we know we're going to face more extreme weather, we're going to face more frequent disasters, things like stormwater management, all together shift. So this concept of more resilient buildings, I think, is very important. It's very important, particularly in developing countries where in many cases, they're going to be the most vulnerable. So over the last 20 years, I think we've been able to have this conversation where greenhouse gases and energy have been the currency of the conversation. And we've been able to have that permeate into the entire industry. But now we're going to need to be able to speak in the currency of risk and risk mitigation. I think it's going to be very important. I think it's something that Denis has already spoke to as it relates to the work that he's done with his building. You know, he had to do all the earthquake work. I mean, resilient building is going to be just as important as everything else, and we can't have the sustainable future that we all want if it's not built on the foundation of strong and resilient communities. That's my last pitch.
Excellent. It's a good last pitch. I just want to thank both Denis and Jason for their continued leadership and taking part in today's conversation, and thank the State Department for hosting this. I know I'm going to be around, especially folks from the international front, if you're interested in finding ways of connecting what our different governments are doing in this space. And I really look forward to sort of the continued conversations this afternoon. Thank you very much.